The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. When Jesus received the news of John the Baptist's death, he withdrew by boat to a lonely place where they could be by themselves. But people heard of this, and, leaving the towns, went after him on foot. So as he stepped ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he took pity on them and healed their sick. When evening came, the disciples went to him and said, "This is a lonely place, and the time has slipped by, so send the people away, and they can go to the villages to buy themselves some food." And Jesus replied, "There is no need for them to go. Give them something to eat yourselves." But they answered, "All we have with us is 5 loaves and 2 fish. "Bring them here to me," he said. He gave orders that the people was to sit down on the grass. Then he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, raised his eyes to heaven and said the blessing, and breaking the loaves, he handed them to his disciples, who gave them to the crowds. They all ate as much as they wanted, and they collected the scraps remaining, 12 baskets full. Those who ate numbered about 5,000 men, to say nothing of women and children. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
You're looking nice, you know, they're Dan, boy. Hey. It's serious competition today as to who will be walking away with the Word of God. A whole Bible. In a real sense, as we celebrate today Emancipation Day, which was in the year, which was the year? Emancipation? Huh?
60.
You see where Muhammad going, eh? All I know where Muhammad going. All I know where Muhammad going. What year was Emancipation? Huh? Well, let's see where my harmony is going. All right, don't hurt yourself. Don't hurt your head. Relax yourself. Google it after. That's the problem right there. That's the problem right there. That in a real sense, we have not come to a consciousness. A consciousness. A consciousness is more than, we can start with wearing African clothes. We can start by singing African songs. But a consciousness is trying to celebrate who we are. Who God has made us to be. And to celebrate the histories of our lives as a people. Every people have a history. Every people have a history. I have been fortunate to live in Europe for 6 years and to travel into different countries in Europe and to experience their histories, their stories that would extend. They sent me some photos of Our Lady Maria de la Grazia, which is a celebration they would have in honor of Our Lady of Grace. And that celebration extends before the new world was rediscovered by Christopher Columbus, before that. And that's a big celebration that they have 500 years ago in that parish. I say that to say, unless we as a people are able to celebrate who we are, then we will not be rooted in our identity. And part of the challenge for us today is to have an identity in which we are rooted in which we can find ourselves, and in which we can celebrate the best of who we are. And that's the challenge. That's a challenge, to celebrate the best of who we are. And I'm using the term we in the context of persons of African descent, who in one sense have had a particular journey and therefore us to look back on their histories, even though we belong first and foremost as Trinidadians and Tobagonians, yet our histories merge into the melting pot of Trinidad and Tobago. An appreciation of one's history does not put one above and beyond any other person, but it's just to appreciate your history. Not because I'm handsome doesn't mean to say you are handsome too. Huh? That doesn't mean to say you are not handsome. Not because I celebrate who I am doesn't mean to say I don't appreciate you for who you are. And we have to make that distinction. We have to make that distinction in a difference of philosophy. I'm using a word that Bob Marley used, huh? Unless the philosophy of that one race holds itself superior to another race is abandoned, then it's what? Then it's war. That's the philosophy. But unless we begin to appreciate who we are and affirm ourselves as to who we are, then nobody's going to do it for you. Nobody's going to do it for you. Nobody's going to do it for you unless you don't celebrate who you are. Unless you don't celebrate God's giftedness and God's reflection in you. And that affirmation of where you came from and who you are and where you want to go. And that is not, in a sense, there's a tradition of going back to Africa. That's not emancipation. That's not emancipation. Emancipation is a recognition of the drama and the dynamics that have taken place in human history, in which persons of African descent were brought from the continent of Africa in order to facilitate an economic superpower, and in so doing made a horrendous passage, which we call the Middle Passage, in which is one of the worst experiences for 6 to 4 weeks at sea crossing the Atlantic, where human beings were stacked one below the other, one on top of the other, in cramped spaces for extended periods of time, with little food and water. And then coming into what we call the New World, having to undergo what is called chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is the worst kind of slavery that the world has known. The worst kind. In spite of all of that, making a journey as a people to forge an identity against a system that is not always fair. That is not always fair. A deeper consciousness must be there. My consciousness came in my travels. If you had told me that before I'd gone to Europe, if you had told me that before I began to travel and to experience different cultures and to experience different peoples, I would not have believed you. But having traveled and having lived in different parts of Europe, I've seen, and not only seen, but experienced some of the experiences of institutional racism. Institutional racism, whereby just because of the color of a person's skin you are targeted. Remember when I went back to do my doctoral defense in 2016? I lived in Rome for 5 years before. Never did anyone stop me. ISIS had bombed Belgium, and they were threatening to blow up the Vatican. And the Italian government put soldiers on the streets and the subways. I was staying in a place, not the place I was there before, another place. And every time I came up the subway, 6 times in a month, they stopped me and asked me for ID. In fact, the soldier, Trinidad, the soldier knew me by heart. He said, Trinidad, because I have to give him the information. Now, I lived there for 5 years. Nobody ever stopped me. But I say that to say that, in a real sense, we have to recognize and become conscious. To become conscious, so dates such as 1834, 1838 should mean something for us. It has to mean something for us. Or today is a waste of time. It has to mean something for us. To recognize the blood, sweat, and tears that the ancestors would have done and would have worked so that we may be able to stand where we are today. Today we take freedom very lightly. We take freedom very lightly. But it was in our generation in 50 years ago. What happened 50 years ago? What happened 50 years ago? Huh? You don't know? If you don't know what happened in 1824, 1838? Oh, Jesus have mercy. Well, let's take all them African clothes. Take them on. Take them on. Black Power Revolution. We had the Black Power Revolution 50 years ago. Huh? Nobody talks about 1970 anymore? Where people went in the cathedral and paid the statues black and all that. Well, I'm too young to remember that. I'm not 50 yet. But some of the more senior persons like Shirley and Gail. Have you there? You know, some of the more senior persons might be able to enlighten me as to what were the events at that time. Huh? But it's important, and herein lies the problem. Part of the problem is a difference in which our socioeconomic situation has evolved. In which everybody, in myself, I remember in secondary school, I wanted nothing to do with history. I was good in history. But I don't know history for. Why don't I make any money from history? I studied to get a job. What can I do as a history teacher? When I pass history, but go and teach history? I went into sciences. So I know I'm a big sphere. I could be anything as a science in sciences. And so we denigrate history, we denigrate the arts, but it is this that gives us our identity. And if we don't have that sense of consciousness, that deep consciousness and that deep identity, if we don't recognize where we have come from and where we have reached and where we are invited to go, then we cannot give our young people the moorings to understand and to move forward and to take forward the baton that will be passed on to them. And that therein lies part of the problem. Part of the problem lies precisely in a lack of self-identity. And when you don't have an identity, then you take on everybody else's identity. Everybody do something, you follow too. Everybody do that, you follow too. Because you think that's the trend, that's the in thing. But you don't have a sense of self, a sense of who you are, a sense and an appreciation and a celebration for who you are. I would have never thought that today was anything special in Trinidad and Tobago. Never. I saw nothing to say that it was special for us. Nothing. Why? Because we can't gather. It doesn't mean to say there are still not ways of affirmation. That's the key thing. Affirmation. Affirmation. If we don't affirm ourselves, who will? Who will? If you don't celebrate what God has made you to be and to become, then who will? And herein lies the challenge for us today. In the gospel, Jesus treats with a particular situation in which the disciples come to Jesus and they're out in the desert and the people were hungry because they're following Jesus. Jesus is doing miracles and healing and so on, and the people come and say, well, let us send them away. The disciples said, no. We can't send them away. They'll fall down and die. And Jesus says something very important. And what shall we do? He says, you get something for them. My dear friends, the underbelly of freedom is responsibility. Jesus is saying to them, you take responsibility. You take responsibility for them. You take responsibility. You go and get something for them. But what we have sold is a freedom without responsibility. And that freedom entails, I want to do anything I want. That's not freedom, by the way. Freedom is not the capacity to do everything you want. In a Christian context and understanding, freedom is that which we use the free gift of ourselves to choose the good for which God has intended us to choose. Anything else, when we don't choose the good, we then fall into slavery, bondage. That's the catch. The freedom is not what I want to do anything that I want to do. That's not freedom. That's an astute sense of how the world understands freedom. Because human beings were never made with absolute freedom. Remember the story of Genesis in the garden? And God said, okay, do what I want. But you have absolute freedom. Don't touch the fruit. See the pineapple down there? You didn't know the fruit was a pineapple. There's a pineapple in the garden. Don't touch the fruit. You don't have absolute freedom to do what you want. Yeah, and the freedom that we are given is only free in as much as we use our freedom to respond to God's laws and God's ways. When we fail to do that, we go into bondage. My dear friends, as a people, we have to celebrate where we have come and what we have done. But we also have to look and see the challenges that are ever before us. Challenges in communities like Maloney, East Port of Spain. Challenges that are ever before us. Because these communities are communities predominantly of men and women of African descent. That's a fact. All right? They're predominantly communities, men and women of African descent. And these communities present for us a challenge. Why? Well, simply because, or not simply because, it's more complex than we can ever imagine, but part of the problem is because there is no sense of identity. There's no sense of identity that can be seen, a deep identity that they can grasp and be rooted in, to celebrate and to realize other possibilities. The liberation that we need today is more than just 1834 as an event, but emancipation is an ongoing process. It never ends. It's an ongoing process in which we continue to reflect and see the ways in which we are invited by the Lord to strive and to realize our fullest potential made in the image and likeness. And therefore, part and parcel of that liberation is understanding how are we to bring liberation in terms of consciousness to our community. You have to face it. You have to face it. And to be able to deal with it. But if we don't, then the danger is that we can then go back into a deep bondage, a deep place of slavery. And yes, it's complex. Yes, there are many issues. Yes, there are all kinds of factors that are involved. But at the basis of it is a sense of connecting people to something bigger than themselves. Connecting people to something bigger than themselves. And enabling people to see the vision and see themselves in a positive way. And so, today is a day of celebration, but it's also a day of realizing that we are far from liberation. You may have legal and political, to extent, liberation from slavery. But then there's the mental aspect, the societal aspect, that we too must continue to strive and struggle. And so the struggle continues. The struggle must continue. But we continue to celebrate the best. That doesn't mean to say that we don't celebrate the best of who we are. Taking responsibility for who we are and for the destiny that we are traversing and for the input in Trinidad and Tobago. Because that's the beauty of Trinidad and Tobago is the cosmopolitan nature in which we live and thrive in. I always have curry mango in my fridge, curry mango goes with everything. It goes with soup, it goes with, you put out curry mango in everything. That's me, I'm a Trinidadian. I'm sure you put ketchup on in soup too, Chelsea. Let's put ketchup on everything. Right? And so we have to understand the cosmopolitan nature. And so any talk of going back to Africa is really a talk that is not based in reality. It's not based in reality. I remember living, when I was in Rome again, having the great opportunity of living with lots of Africans. The first college I was at, there were many guys from Nigeria. And then they would pull up a table and they would start to talk in the Igbo language. I would just take my chair and go on the next table where I talk with the Indians and all the Filipinos in English. Because me, I don't know Igbo. You're saying, you are not really, when they started talking in Igbo, they may say, you are really a part of us. You may be blacker than us, but you are not African. You understand? So I pull my chair and I go and I sit down and I go and talk with the English speakers. Alright? It's important to recognize, you go back. If you want to go back to Africa, go. But make sure you learn the people language. And they speak about 6 different languages. They speak about 6 different dialects. And so it's important to recognize the cultures are different. They love fufu. So on a Sunday, in college I stayed at, we didn't have, nobody cooked. So people would cook their traditional thing and they would go down and cook their fufu and dry fish. Father, just come for some now. No, I'm going by the Chinese restaurant there. Yeah, you like that? Down pork in it, you like that? You like that at all? That is not me! That is not me! And I'm not apologizing for it. It's not me. Give me my payout because I'm a Trinidadian. Give me my roti. Give me my bus shop. That's who I am. And unless we understand the relationship between identity, historical identity, and where we have come from in this, to use a Napoleon word, the bastardization of who we are, then we will never understand ourselves. Because we are not hybrid anything. Nobody in Trinidad is hybrid. Nobody. Not East Indian, not person of East Indian descent, neither person of African descent. Nobody is hybrid, nothing. Except Trinidadian. But that is what makes us rich, in the ways in which the cultures have come together and have created something new. And so, if I am celebrating who I am, it doesn't mean anything else. But to celebrate, and you are celebrating who you are, it doesn't take away anything from anybody, because we come together to celebrate one another. And that's important. That's important for who we are. And so, my dear brothers and sisters, today, let us give God thanks. We have made a very, very long journey as a people. A very long journey. Let us thank God for for this journey that we have made as persons of African descent. In some mystical way, some magical way, by the faith and grace of God, we have been sustained. Through probably one of the worst experiences that human beings can undergo. We have been sustained. And so that is by the power of God. And so today is really a day of thanksgiving. Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving for our ancestors who have really paid the price so that we are able to stand here. Men and women educated, men and women intelligent, men and women talented, men and women who have made contribution to the society and to the communities, men and women who have lots to offer. That's a celebration that we have to do today. The affirmation of who we are. And that's what Jesus says. You give them something. You give them something yourself. Take responsibility. Freedom demands responsibility. Let us take responsibility for our communities. Let us take responsibility for our nation. Let us take responsibility for our people. Happy Emancipation Day.